There's two ways of looking at the world from my point of view. And one would be Matthias Desmond coined this term mass formation. That's what most people believe. And in the modern world, he says, the more ridiculous it is, the easier it is to sell. And you can make observations of this. And then there's the old Latin contra mundum, against the world. You can interpret that any way that you want. So somewhere around the 6th grade, I decided, I didn't know the Latin. We studied Latin in the 9th grade, and I didn't know it for a long time later, but I decided I was in the latter category, okay? So that defined my life a little differently than most people. When we talk about the Great Recession, if you talk about anything in economics or in life, it's as compared to something else, okay? So there's an assumption within the Great Depression that we did everything that we could to save the people. My mother believed that, and I never could convince her otherwise. But so I'm going to begin to saying that at the founding there was a national bank and it had a 20-year charter, and it expired in somewhere around 1811. Then there was a second national bank, and when Jackson was president, he didn't like the idea of a national bank, and he abolished it and was totally gone in 1835. So think about Federal Reserve Bank, this national bank, did not exist from 1835 until 1913. How did we survive all those years without a national bank? That's a rhetorical question. We actually did quite well. If you went back to 1860, the cooperative banks within the Boston area, they could clear checks overnight, okay? It took the Federal Reserve Bank until about 1980 where they could clear checks across the whole country overnight. So even 100 years later, universally, we couldn't clear checks. Now, if the check was in New York, maybe it took 2 days, et cetera. But they had a mechanism within private banking system of clearing checks and making a banking system actually work quite incredibly well. If you think about the Great Depression, we talked about the central banking. There was a bank panic in 1907, and the stock market had gone down considerably. And who was alive at that time was our friend J.P. Morgan. And J.P. Morgan was probably the most powerful man in the country at that time, very, very wealthy. If you think about the bank J.P. Morgan, all this time later, 100 and some years later, is still the most powerful bank in the world, the most prosperous bank. So there must have been some good coming out of J.P. Morgan. So in 1907, he called the New York bankers and said, you know, the market's in a bad place. It's going to get far worse unless we take action. So all the New York bankers that are important need to come to they call it the museum now. It's at 36th and Madison in New York. And we're going to solve this problem tonight, okay? So the bankers met all night. Before the market opened in the morning, they made an announcement, and they created this liquidity within the market so that you could buy stocks on margin, and they solved the problem overnight. And that's an indication of the power of the private sector of individual initiative with no central bank. Now, at the same time, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, and others a couple years later met in Jekyll Island. Anybody ever hear of the creature from Jekyll Island? It's now called the Federal Reserve Bank, okay? And it was a very secret meeting because they knew that the people, the voters, the real people did not want a federal bank, okay? They did not want a Federal Reserve. That didn't come along until 1913. So in 1907, money supply was expanded. U.S. Treasury was unable to solve the problem. So there's the U.S. Treasury is not very large in 1907, but they couldn't solve the problem. So the conclusion was that even though the large federal government can't solve it, private industry mobilized, stabilized the economy, and for most people, they never heard about the Panic of 1907, and they probably never will hear about it. There was also a major recession in 1920-21. So what happened in that time frame? The war was over. All the men are coming back from the military. Okay, so they're all looking for jobs. You had labor strife. You had the Spanish flu. You had union strife. You had a major contraction of government spending. Okay, so that's not too good for the economy. And he had a monetary policy that probably basically did nothing. Even though now, in that time frame, you had a Federal Reserve Bank, but they didn't know what to do, so they did nothing. They went to Harding, who was the president at the time, and said, we have this recession. CPI was negative, maybe dropped 15 to 8%, so you had a recession in prices. GDP declined by 7%. Unemployment was estimated at 11.7%, pretty high in a modern time frame. That's a pretty serious recession. So they went to Harding and said, President Harding, we have this terrible recession. What should we do? And he said, well, I don't know anything about economics. Ask Mellon. Andrew Mellon was the Treasury Secretary. And Mellon said, the best thing to do is just do nothing. Okay? And that's what they did. They did nothing. And in about an 18-month period of time, by June of 2021, problem solved. Unemployment went way down. Economy began to hum along. Then we talked about what? The roaring 20s? So we moved into a very robust economy for the next 8 years by doing absolutely nothing. So the federal government and the Federal Reserve took no action, problem solved. And now we get into mass formation, what everybody knows. The market crashed in 1929, and it created the Great Recession, Great Depression. Well, and what caused that? Unfettered capitalism, market speculation are common refrains. So this terrible capitalism caused all these outrageous problems. So most economic downturns are a result of excess capacity. Eventually you have lower prices and inflation. So eventually prices begin to come down. And the Austrian economists say that the cure for a recession is a good recession. Doesn't sound very intuitive, though. It is self-correcting, okay? The market corrects in real time. What happens when the market gets bad news? In real time, immediately it corrects, okay? What happens if you lose your job or you make less money or have financial adversity? In real time, immediately, you make corrections. So the marketplace, which are people, make decisions in real time, and as a result, the correction is fairly rapid. Now, when you try to fix the problem through the government, now we have serious trouble. So somewhere around March 8th and 29, Paul Warburg and New York Times predicted a financial crisis because of excessive speculation in the stock market. Does anybody see any relevance to this point in time where stocks are worth, some stocks are worth trillions of dollars, and they go up every single day? You know, every day the market goes up, everybody's happy, you know. Is that realistic? Maybe not. As Charlie Munger would often say, this will probably not end well. So we had the market crash October 29, 1929. Everybody knows a Black Tuesday. But at the end of the year, and think about this back to 1987. In 87, we had a severe market crash. But by the end of the year, if you hadn't heard about the market crash, nothing really happened, okay? At the end of 1929, the unemployment rate was 3.2%. Okay? So it didn't immediately crash the economy. That's fairly clear. And the federal budget was about $3 billion. Can you imagine a $3 billion federal budget? It's unimaginable in this time frame, isn't it? So what happened in 1930? Herbert Hoover's the president, and Calvin Coolidge described Hoover as a man with solutions looking for problems. Did you ever know anybody like that? So what did Hoover do? This idea of tariffs had been brewing because of complaints about the farmers. So there's always special interests that complain about unfair competition, etc. And so the idea of the tariffs originally was that we'll do something for the farmers, we'll appease the farmers, and we'll get their votes. That was the idea. But what happens when it goes through Congress? It turns into sausage. And every special interest wants to get a portion of it. So in 1930, there was called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. And Hoover was told by 500 or 1,000 economists, do not sign that bill. It will be tragic if you sign this bill. But Hoover, being the man with solutions looking for problems, and in a kind of a political predicament, signs the bill. And as a result, free trade, so the tariffs shot up very high. Think about current point in time, okay? And international trade just began to collapse. And then we had what is known as reciprocal tariffs, okay? Everybody else put the same tariffs on us, sort of negated the whole idea. Meanwhile, now here's what's interesting about Smoot and Hawley. At the very next election, one was a senator, one was a member of Congress, a House member. They were voted out. Think about this historically. They were voted out of office. So what did the people think in 1931 about Smoot-Hawley? They didn't like it, okay? So there are many times that the voters are much smarter than the general status quo. It's not always true, but it can be true. Federal budget continues to rise, so now it's $4.6 billion. It's risen 42%. And in 1982, let's go back to Coolidge, had a tax rate of 25%, and he called it the scientific tax rate. He and Mellon conspired to say, we need the lowest possible tax rate to get the maximum amount of revenue. And they decided on 25%. So somewhere around 1924, the marginal tax rate, the highest rate, was 25%. And Coolidge's worry was that it would generate too much money by having a lower tax rate, and there would be a call for bigger government. That was his biggest worry. He wasn't worried that they wouldn't have enough money. A little bit counterintuitive, and he was right. During Hoover's tenure, from 1923 until the end of 28, in real dollars, the federal budget declined. Okay, so for the entire time that he was president, every year the budget went down. And every year the budget was balanced. And the stock market really crash occurred because of excessive speculation. And additionally, in that time frame, you could borrow on margin 90%. So you could put up 10% of the value of a stock, and 90% would be lent to you. Well, what happens if the market goes down 11%? Your broker sells you out, and it creates a stampede of selling, okay? The marginal rate today, and has been for a long time, is 50%. So you have to put up half the money. So the market, your particular stock has to go down 50% before your broker just sells you out, and they do it instantaneously. So these orders just jam right in the system, and they create panics. Meanwhile, the budget continues to rise. 33 budget's $4.6 billion, 34, 6.5. These are government solutions, okay? By 1941, the budget was $13 billion. Think about a 10-year period of time, we went from $3 billion to $13 billion in spending. There was also in that time frame what we now call lawfare. So FDR prosecuted Andrew Mellon for tax evasion. Now, Mellon came from a great family of bankers, and it was historically traditional in that time, and I think to some degree, large degree today, where successful business people are very scrupulous about paying their taxes because they don't want to deal with the IRS. They don't even want an inquiry, so we do that. We deposit more than we have to, so there's not going to be any dispute. We let all the little stuff go, and it's a good strategy because it keeps you out of trouble, and the IRS just has nothing on you. You're reporting your taxes honestly. And for most of us, we believe that's what Andrew Mellon did. He was a stand-up guy. He's one of the most brilliant bankers of his time. But he's being prosecuted by FDR for tax evasion. Think about modern point in time, lawfare. He was not guilty, okay? What did the voters do? What did the people say? This is just nonsense, okay? But it undermined his life, and it made it very, very difficult. So for all the initiatives of FDR, we went from about 7 or 8% unemployment in 1931 to 18% unemployment, and at times it was 24%. So for 8 years of initiatives, we went from 7, 8% to 18% unemployment. Would it be fair to say it didn't work too well, did it? And this is a comment I found. I couldn't get attribution, and he says, the Depression was the most wonderful thing for young lawyers, economists, PhDs, who didn't have a clue how to find a job. And suddenly they were working in Washington, running the country. It left a permanent impression. They were capable of managing the economy, and the government can do a whole lot of good, okay? We can have you go dig holes in the ground and then fill them back in, but you had a job. And people started to believe in that time frame, well, it's better than nothing. Now we just mail the check to you. We don't waste time digging holes in the ground. If you look commentary on the Great Recession from knowledgeable people, Anna Schwartz and Milton Friedman spent post-Depression 20 years researching what really happened. So they started somewhere around 1940, and they went all the way up to the early 60s. And they wrote a book called The Monetary History of the United States from 1867 until 1960, right after the book was published. And Anna Schwartz, and think about Anna Schwartz and Friedman were from what we call the Monetary School of Economics at the University of Chicago. They're ultra brilliant people. In some cases, I was reading the commentary on, they both went to the same college. They thought some of the professors weren't that bright. Well, it's relative, okay? Compared to them, they probably weren't that bright, but they were pretty smart people. Anna Schwartz did a lot of the legwork, and I knew this somewhat anecdotally from my grandfather. The Federal Reserve took no action during this time frame, but the banks were panicked, okay, because we're creating this panic through the government. And so what's a bank do when they're panicking? They call in all the loans they can because they're afraid they're going to go out of business. And that's exactly what happened in 1930, 31, 32. And Anna Schwartz actually went to these banks, and I don't know how she got their records, but she would go in and ask if she could review their records from that time frame. So they documented that the banking system contracted the money supply by about 30 to 33%. So think about it this way. If we drained 30% of your blood out today, you probably won't feel real peppy, right? you might have a hard time to function, right? So when you take 30% of the currency out, you have a very weak economy. You have an economy that's really under tremendous amount of stress. And how would you remove that stress? We get somebody else's blood and we give you the 30% back, and in a day or two you'd feel pretty good, right? Okay, so if we re-energize as J.P. Morgan did in '07, now people have money, they're less afraid, they start making good decisions, etc. So Friedman and Schwartz knew without the Federal Reserve as a clearinghouse, the failure of the Federal Reserve to expand the money supply during a banking panic was the central problem. And that problem exists for a very long period of time. Friedman, and when Schwartz and Friedman issued this book, traditional economists just laughed at them, okay? They're all sitting up here. We don't believe anything you put out. So about 20 years later, it began to seep in, okay? These are really brilliant people, allegedly brilliant people. It took them 20 years to think, maybe they're onto something. There was a comment made by Ben Bernanke, was Federal Reserve Chairman, self-described expert on the Great Depression. At one point in time, he said, you know, I think Milton Friedman taught us something, okay? The contraction of the money supply was the big problem. And what did Bernanke do when we had the financial crisis some years ago? He expanded the money supply. Way too much, way too much. But he took the lesson from Friedman. And again, they were laughing at him at the time, but Friedman and Schwartz were sitting down here, okay? And they're saying, we're gonna get to the real cause of this problem because it's important that we understand it in the very long term. So we took what could have been a 1 or 2 year recession and we turned it into a depression that lasted all the way up to World War I. That's what really happened. With all these crazy programs, endless ideas and endless programs, they literally destroyed milk, they killed pigs, they encouraged companies to pay more wages. Okay, what do you do when you have a bad economy? Everybody tightens up, right? And that begins to solve the problem. They did the reverse. They encouraged unions. They literally did everything. If you believe in any laws of economics, they did literally everything exactly wrong. And they got bad outcomes. And this is Mises 101. All government interventions, you may disagree with this, all government interventions lead to trouble. And then they lead to more government interventions. Okay, the Affordable Care Act, why is the government shut down right now? We had the Affordable Care Act that was going to lower the cost of health care. And we provided some temporary subsidies under COVID. And now what they're saying is we need to make these subsidies permanent because affordable care, health care, is not affordable. See the second intervention? And that second intervention today leads to our government being shut down. You could argue whether that's a good or bad thing, and it suits me fine, but it can cause some trouble. Amity Shlaes, who will be speaking here in the Triangle, I believe later this month, wrote a book called The Forgotten Man. And the forgotten man was a term coined by William Graham Sumner, referring to the ordinary taxpayer, the worker, the contributor, the entrepreneur, bears the cost of government spending and regulation, and in the end does not help the poor. So this idea of we have good intentions, reference back to our talk earlier today, that's great that you have good intentions. You also need to have good actions. And that's not always the case. Schley's criticizes the New Deal as constant experimentation, created uncertainty, created chaos. Schley's argument is that the New Deal policies froze investment, created an environment that hindered economic growth, and prolonged the Great Depression. It's almost obvious, if you don't know anything, how does a recession last 10 years? It's because you take all these interventions. Why is a house unaffordable today when 20 years ago the government says we're going to make housing affordable to everybody, and now it's unaffordable? Why was Medicare affordable and fairly good 25 years ago? Now it's unaffordable, and the lines are going to get longer. You see the correlation here? The private market, think of you and your individual and your family. You make decisions every day. What kind of food are you going to get? Where do you buy your food? What kind of clothes are you going to put on? How am I going to raise my children? Every day you're making those decisions. And you're making with the intent of improving family life, personal life, etc. If someone sent you a mandate every day how you're going to run your family, it'd be kind of hard, wouldn't it, right? Because you would say, well, you don't seem to understand my family and my circumstance right this second. Schley also says the New Deal policies were often driven by political considerations influenced by collective ideas in Europe rather than sound economic policy. Do we see evidence of that today? There's an article today in the Wall Street Journal that talks about Europe returning to some sanity relative to climate and bureaucracy and regulation, because they've just stifled the economy so hard that it almost can't move. And if your children were 22 years old, graduating from college in Europe, they have a very slim chance of getting a job. They're going to be unemployed for a long period of time. It's just not a good place. We haven't gotten to that point. So I'm going to give you a quick summary. I'm also going to provide these slides to you so you just have this information. Smoot-Hawley stopped international trade, high marginal tax rate. Suppose I'm just taking 25% of your income. You're not real happy about it. And I say, well, I've decided I need 63% of your income. You'd be pretty mad, wouldn't you? Yes, you would. You might punch me right in the nose. Contraction of money supply, estimated at between 30 and 33%. Massive government spending. What's our solution to all problems in America today? Spend more money, borrow more money. Fear and uncertainty froze the economy, extended the duration of the Depression. New Deal, endless interventions, destroying food, raising milk prices, destroying pigs, pushing for higher wages is going to solve the problem. No, lower wages will solve the problem, and then the wages will go higher. Lawfare we talked about. Focus on consumers rather than producers. Say's Law, 1803. Overall supply creates overall demand. Supply creates demand. Demand does not create supply. Did anybody in 2020 demand something that didn't show up? We all did, right? So demand does not create supply, but you'll hear the government continuously say we need to prime the pump, give the people money, and the economy will flourish. No, you have to build factories. You have to build capacity. That's what makes the economy flourish. Business intimidation was rampant. Seems like the same thing is going on today. If you're with the in crowd, you don't pay tariffs. If you're captive air, you're paying tariffs, okay? And you're paying big time. Political considerations, a whole lot of government nonsense versus sound economic policy. And economics, the School of Economics is developed from the Salamancan philosophers in Spain 500 years ago. They had a general understanding, and they had much of the economy, they had it right. Adam Smith, 1776, Wealth of Nations, documented most of what he told us in that time frame is correct, and is still correct today. There's always nuance within any general assertions. So the laws of economics, supply and demand, supply creates new opportunities. Think supply of an individual. A great teacher comes in, okay, we just made an improvement in the world. We gave students an opportunity to learn, but we need that great teacher. That's an example of supply creating new demand and new opportunities within the economy. So I'm closing right on time. We have time for a little discussion. I'll take the first question.
Yeah, so from an Austrian point of view, you mentioned like how monetary they invest back in. I was wondering if you think there's an ability for increasing the money supply with like not having the banks or the Fed be accountable, but also because we see it later on that the banks fail and are irresponsible and they get banked out. It's kind of a great question.
Yeah, the Austrian economists would believe there shouldn't be a Federal Reserve. There shouldn't be the market would set the rates. So think about today, the 10-year rate is set by the market, and the very short rate is set by the Fed. And the short rate has been higher than the 10-year rate. So you could borrow money for 30 days and get paid more money than you invested your money for 10 years, we paid you less money. Doesn't sound right, does it? Huh? That's market manipulation. The banks expand the money supply on their own because they take 80% of the money you have in there and they lend it out to other people. That creates new money. So expansion of the money supply is very dangerous. And we see that now where we had this massive expansion in the supply of money, created massive inflation to a point where you can hardly pay for a car, you can hardly pay for a house. You can't even buy the house to begin with. I wonder, one thing I didn't have in my notes, but the New Deal came up with the idea of the 30-year mortgage, so homes would be affordable. If you buy currently a 15-year versus 30-year, you're going to pay 2.5 times interest, kind of relative, depending on terms and conditions, 2.5 times the interest, as opposed to maybe paying $100 or $200 a month more and paying that loan off. So these ideas that sound on the surface, okay, everybody believes in the 30-year mortgage, right, okay? But there's a lot of pain there, okay? So when you have a false economy, somebody's suffering, but somebody's also profiting, okay? So Wall Street profits in many cases. You look at private equity today, they profit, but somebody is suffering somewhere. So following good economic principles creates fairness for everybody. And there's going to be fluctuations. There's going to be good times and better times and bad times. The market will adjust, okay? Most people are going to go to work, and they're going to want to be prosperous. And the people will make the corrections. Within families, we make corrections. Within businesses, we make corrections. And that's what makes an overall economy. Other question or comment? Yes, sir.
So essentially, you're arguing that politicians should just let the economy solve itself. What stops those politicians who, the voting bloc likes to see acting from just getting not reelected? So essentially, we want to see our politicians solve the problems. At least
the last thing you want to do is have a politician solve any problem. Does anybody know what Groucho Marx said about politicians? He said, politicians go looking for trouble, find plenty of it, misdiagnose it, and come up with the wrong solution. If you think about it, Marx said that in the 50s. They come up with a problem. Everybody doesn't have health care. This is a national crisis. We have to get health care for everybody. It's an entitlement. Okay, great. All right, that's okay. I can go with that. How are we going to do that? There was a point, I don't know if you remember this, maybe 1993. Hillary was going to be the czar of health control. And among other things, she wanted to decide how many people would be allowed to go into medical school. So fast forward that today, you want a specialist. Unless you have some really good connections, you're going to wait 3 months, 4 months, 6 months. Can you even think conceptually that you would tell this young man or woman, I'm not going to let you go into medical school. I don't think we need you. She's like, whoa, does that make the point? The collectivism and the one size fits all it just doesn't make any sense. Every one of you has a good brain. Every one of you has capabilities. And you make the best decisions you can. And if you make them wrong, you improve them over time, okay? That's how an economy should work. When you have these strictures, people love regulation. They think, well, if the government regulates those bad business people, those terrible people. Well, bad business people that produce bad products go bankrupt, okay? Customers don't buy from them anymore. So yeah, they may get away with a little bit, but it doesn't last very long. We see evidence of that in the marketplace. So the free market, yeah, it's chaotic, it's messy. There's winners, there's losers. But we can be a loser now and we can be a winner later. That's just the nature of personal growth. Other comment or question?
Yeah, I've listened to another podcast and get thoroughly confused about the matter. I thought maybe you could speak to this in the time frame of the early 1900s, where the issue of tariffs was the primary source of government income, and then somehow we moved to income tax. It was going to start off just really small, 3 or 4%.
Now, the little people, as they call them, the little people weren't going to pay any income tax.
Right.
Yeah, nothing.
Yeah.
But by 4 years later, they were all paying income tax. See the deception of the politician? But go ahead.
Well, no. I was going to ask you to speak to just that transition between tariffs providing the government income, I suppose, as opposed to income tax.
Well, what did the income tax do? It exploded the federal government.
Right.
And it's still exploding. And it's been over 100 years and it continues. Whereas when we had tariffs, we could say tariffs aren't a great idea, but they weren't large enough to destroy the economy. When you start talking 25, 50, 65% tariffs, they are large enough to destroy the economy, which is what we're dealing with now. Frame of reference, income tax, 1913. What else happened in 1913? Federal Reserve Bank. What else happened? Election of senators. Now, so most people say, well, isn't democracy, shouldn't we vote for our senators? The founders didn't think so. And why? Because if North Carolina appointed a senator, they had to please the people in North Carolina. Do you think our North Carolina senators care about pleasing the people in North Carolina? Heck no. They're Democrat or Republican. Look at them right now. They're locked in with the party. So what sounded intuitively to be good, so if you want to say what destroyed the country, 1913. The progressives knew more than the founders. What a joke. You may not like the founders, you may think they're great old men and whatever you think about them, they were a heck of a lot smarter than we were. They were very erudite, they were highly educated. They went back to Cicero, they went to Aristotle, they were classic learners. They said this at the Jefferson Library, that when Madison was going to write the Constitution, Jefferson said, I'm going to send you 200 books, and don't you dare write that Constitution until you read those 200 books. You probably heard that, right? Think about it in that time frame. I'm going to send you 200 difficult books, and you're not allowed to do anything until you read those books. Think about that in time frame. So the founders got so many things right. They got some things wrong. We know that, okay? Is there any of us that didn't get some things wrong in our lifetime? No, there's no such a person. So we have to look at the good they did, and we understand you didn't handle this situation well. Eventually it got corrected. So the goal should be, as our speaker said this morning, to be as virtuous as possible. And we're not going to be perfect, and we're going to get things wrong, but we're also going to correct them over time. Other comments? Or
I'm not sure if I've worded it in my mind quite yet, but I'm going to try. Do you think that it would be possible to have a virtual presidency with non-virtuous citizens, or vice versa? Could we have...
No. Okay, I'm going to reference Has anybody ever heard The Road to Serfdom is written by Friedrich Hayek, 1943, thereabouts. And he's got a chapter in there and it says, why did the worst get to the top? And he has 3 reasons. There's a limited number of virtuous intellectual people who would choose the most virtuous person. They're a small number. The politician, first of all, they pick out a group of people they don't like. It could be the Mexicans, it could be the Chinese, it could be the Jews, it could be the Catholics, it doesn't matter. You pick one, and then you bang, bang, bang. Our problems are all caused by that group of people. And then people are like, that's right, yeah. It's the Catholics, it's those darn Jews, it's the Mexicans, and they just pound the table on them. And then you have the gullible, okay? I'm gonna provide a free lunch to you. Now that sounds really good, you know, yeah, I'm all in on that. It's called the gullible. So Hayek identified, why do we get the worst people? We will not vote for virtuous people. Could be an anomaly once in a while. You got Youngkin up in Virginia, got elected. It's an anomaly. And the Austrian economists, they allow for an anomaly. Here's what they say. Every president will get worse than the last one. We will allow for an anomaly, Reagan. Okay? So until we can blame the politicians, but it's the gullible and the bias, the prejudice that put them in office. So it's really our fault. And they're acting on our bad behavior, if you like. And so somebody gets up and says, I give free health care to everybody. I'll give everybody a car. It's like, bam, I'm all in for that guy. See what happens? And we're all subject to a little bit of envy, a little desire for the free lunch. And my mentor was Bill Peterson, who was a student and colleague of Mises at NYU in New York. And he would say to me every time we'd have a call, Bob, remember, none of us get it all right. It's a good thing to remember, and it kind of came up in the talk today. We can get really heady about what we believe, but we got to find out what other people believe. And very often we find out, I wasn't right about that issue. Okay, so being around other people, listening to other people makes us a better person. I think we're timed out, but I appreciate your patience. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.